everyone. My name is Marc Rand. I'm a managing partner at Community Capital Advisors. We work with foundations and CDFIs around the country on creating more equitable places to live. And today I'm honored to speak with my friend Rashad Haynes with Foundation for Louisiana around lending to entrepreneurs of color. I think it's a super interesting topic in any day, but especially now during COVID and during the more recent social justice marches for Black Lives Matter, et cetera. I think it now is an extremely important time that we listen to leaders of color and understand what's going on in the Black community and in communities of color, et cetera. As we look at supporting communities of color and foundations supporting communities of color, I think it's one thing to say, yay, we stand with you and Black Lives Matter, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, Rashad. It's another to say, how do we support businesses and how do we support entrepreneurs of color and help folks actually, continue to thrive and come out of poverty or whatever the issue is, or just, to expand jobs and to create a vital pipeline of stores and services and et cetera for communities of color and for everyone. So anyway, would love to, if you could just introduce yourself, and then we'll start in with some questions, and would love just to kind of you to answer that first one around what you're seeing. So just kind of big topic. So
so my name is Rashad Haynes. Background is I like to call myself a recovering banker. I started off my career at KeyBank and as a corporate analyst, and that's where I got kind of my fundamentals of lending. And then I spent about 13 years at Liberty Bank and Trust, a small community bank down in Louisiana. And from there, I did some entrepreneurial work, and now I'm managing a small fund at the Foundation for Louisiana.
Yeah. And Rashad, let's start in just kind of like big picture. And, tell me a little bit about like how race and class have affected communities of color, especially entrepreneurs of color, and why it's so important to support, folks through traditional banking and otherwise.
So starting off with a simple question, right? Communities of color, have a number of challenges and entrepreneurs, a number of challenges that are unique and that need addressing. So just to back up, historically, one of the biggest challenges for entrepreneurs of color has been lack of access to capital. So not that long ago, there were actual laws in place that wouldn't allow you to go to banks, traditional banks, to get loans or to lend in certain areas. So, it was written into the laws. More recently, it's more of a unspoken rule. So it's just harder. One, just knowing where to go. We're generations behind. We've lost back. We're just catching up or trying to catch up from those years of being left out of the traditional banking system. And then just literally a lack of access, so not knowing who to talk to or, not having those connections in those communities. So those things have been plaguing the communities of color for a long time. And that's, one of the things I've been working in my career to try to address.
Yeah, and what I also find frustrating too is some people say, well, if it's just an application, it's just an application, like how do I know if Rashad is Black or not? But then there's the name biases too, right? Like how many white people do I know that have the name Rashad Haynes? Probably not too many. So so there's that piece that plays into it as well.
Yeah, there's names, there's zip codes. I've been fortunate to have and I haven't always been really happy to have a name like Rashad, a unique name out there, but you know what's coming at you. So it's not, I'm not caught by surprise when you get there. So there are a number of ways to identify who you are. A lot of them have been well documented. But yeah. The data is pretty clear on that. Minorities or minorities, people of color, those disadvantaged groups have a less likelihood of getting those loans or getting getting placement in a whole or higher rates and all those other sort of things that we see in the news.
And so kind of as a lender, both of us, years in the trenches, right? What do you think is the difference that people should consider when trying to be supportive and unbiased or whatever, which is obviously difficult to do, let's be honest. What should we consider, or what should lenders consider when lending to entrepreneurs of color versus, someone like me?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. One of the big things that I have encountered, in lending money to all kinds of different people, is the biggest difference between minorities and the majority folks. The people come to banks, minorities particularly come to banks as that first source of capital. And when typically, I remember in my first job, they taught me that the first source of capital is normally coming from the 3 F's, friends, family, and fools. And so that equity, that lack of equity sort of puts you behind in those ratios that we talk about all the time, so those loan to values or debt to income, that skin in the game. So sometimes some allowances need to be made for that, particularly with entrepreneurs in color, just to kind of get them started, to allow you to get started in there, especially in the banking industry. Because if you don't get that start, or you don't have that access to that capital for when your initial plan doesn't work right away, then you're handicapped where some of your other peers may not be. So so those things take into consideration, and maybe put a little bit more weight on really judging the character of that individual, and really looking into some of those other 5 C's that we learned about.
I think that's great. I'm curious, we did a little work together in Louisiana, and understanding a bit more about your history is helpful. In the news, and I know you're a news junkie too, and on NPR the other day, there was a special on, I forget who it was, I think probably our dear friend, Mr. Kai Risdall on NPR, but they were talking about the lack of banks that are owned and operated by people of color, especially the Black community. And I'm just curious, any thoughts on that, or what you see?
So I did, I worked for Liberty Bank and Trust for the last 10 years. It was the 3rd or 4th largest minority bank, African American owned bank in the country. And so, I had an opportunity to meet a number of different bank presidents out there, and those sort of things. One of the things that's missing when you look at these minority banks, and one of the things that that we're able to do, is they're just, it's hard to put a real value on just having people that either look like you, that live in your community, that just understand. So there's this cultural understanding where your entire bank, from the teller level all the way up to the underwriters to the vice presidents, are African American. Then you can, when you hear certain situations in a bank, you might be able to relate that to something that happened to your uncle or your friend or something like that. And that helps with making those decisions, going back to that character side of it. And so, and also there's this affinity too. You go to church with these people, you go to, or, worship wherever you worship with these folks, you go to the grocery store, you're going to see them. So that they're more likely to pay. So this is an affinity that you have with these Black banks. And it also takes away some of the nerves of the individuals coming to borrow from you. And so it's
let's be honest, going to a bank is scary for anyone, let alone, somebody that may not be traditionally served by banking. So I think it's fantastic what you're saying, and so important too, which leads me to kind of the next question. I'd love to hear from you around, what bright spots do you see in kind of lending to communities of color or banks or whatever? And then I want to talk to you a little bit about what the role philanthropy can play to support small businesses, especially small businesses owned and operated by communities of color, which again, I think is so critical. As a program director for a very large foundation previously, how do we think about community development? It's one thing to build affordable housing, but actually supporting folks, living there and thriving is a whole nother matter. So sorry for a long-winded question, but what's bright spots do you see? And then let's talk about the role of philanthropy.
Yeah, well, I'm encouraged, when you lend that money out to folks in your community, there's this multiplier effect. The entrepreneurs tend to hire people from their community, people they know. And so, the more employment you have, the more opportunities you create, the more they create other opportunities. So, as these businesses grow, they donate money in the community, they hire folks, so all those good things, and I've seen that happen. And bright spots, they're hard to find right now. So I look really really hard, but one of the things that is encouraging, I've seen more allies kind of sticking up and really understanding not only the power of money. I'm a money guy, you're a money guy. But they're starting to make that connection, and so I feel like there is a way to move this momentum forward and build a better country for everyone.
Yeah. When you were talking a little bit about the bright spots and communities and looking at folks in the neighborhood with a job, or not a job but a business or whatever, I was thinking, I know you're a father, and to see like your father or your mother have a business, that's a very different mindset of growing up versus something else, which may not be as pleasant. So
well, that's super true. I grew up in a very low middle class neighborhood in Ohio, and you don't have, pardon me, but you don't have a ton of so your exposure really drives where you go. So if you see
right.
a number of business owners and you see a number of people employed and just doing those things, you're much more likely to see that path, and it makes it real to you. Whereas if you don't have those opportunities, if you see black banks, you see the power of, I remember, when I worked at Liberty and in my days now too, we had a kind of mandatory volunteering thing. So we go to schools and things like that. And there were kids in those schools that had never seen a black man in a suit outside of a court, and that just, then this is, this isn't 1950, this is 2010, that just had never seen a black man in a suit. And or they automatically assume you're an attorney and like a defense attorney. So and I went to a bunch of different schools, and that's sort of what you see. And so just the more exposure you give to these folks, and that's what entrepreneurs do, they create this exposure, and that's
plant that seed.
Yeah,
plant that seed. Yeah, sorry to cut you off. Yeah,
no, absolutely.
Let's go back to the idea of philanthropy. And what do you think philanthropy's foundations, private foundations, banks, foundations, whatever, what do you think they can be doing right now to be more supportive? I mean, it's hard out here for everybody, right? Yeah. But let's be honest, the doesn't matter if it's communities of color or not, like the lower you are on the food chain, the more it's going to be difficult, right? But what do you think the philanthropy can do, especially given the most recent kind of spotlight on Black Lives Matter? What do you think? What would be helpful?
I think philanthropy plays a big role. I'm newer to the philanthropy world. The last 2 to 3 years, I've worked with a number of different philanthropic organizations. I think that the biggest help they could be is, we spoke earlier about this gap in equity, and we talk about equity has all these different meanings, right? But I'm talking equity in a financial sense, so like you can add that equity that entrepreneur doesn't have. A quick aside, I remember working with, a number of other folks and people that I went to college with and things like that, when they started their business, you could just literally call your mom, or even there was a story of this guy just called his aunt, and his aunt just had $250,000 just to give him to just get going on his business. And that's this wealth that's been created in this country over the last couple of centuries that we're missing out on. So some of this philanthropic money could kind of fill that gap to make banks feel more comfortable lending, because banks, to be fair, they have criteria they have to meet. They have,
shareholders,
all these other sort of things. So you can make a deal a lot better if you're able to put 5-10% equity into a deal. That you expect to get paid back in some sort of way, possibly. But if you just put the equity out there and get out of the way of some of these entrepreneurs, I think you'd see some amazing results from it. And so I think that's one role philanthropy could play. The other role is just the connection. The outside of money, the biggest thing is, a lot of these entrepreneurs, they have a great idea, have a great work sense, maybe have a great experience, but they may not know an attorney, or may not know an accountant, or may not know suppliers. And so those are the things that make your business viable for a long period of time. So making those connections that these philanthropic organizations have, they have out there. So just kind of putting that out there, I think would be really helpful. And I'm speaking more from a finance sense. So in helping the business world, there are a lot of other things I think, along the Black Lives Matter topic that you could help, making some donation grants to criminal justice and, police, all those other sort of things. But on a strictly financial sense, I think adding that equity makes a big difference.
Yeah, I also think too the role that philanthropy can play is along the lines of providing PRIs, or program-related investments, at a super low interest rate, and providing some capacity building to operate the fund. So that would be helpful. Guarantees can also be helpful. I've also seen where a lot of foundations provide those seeder deposits as well. So so I think there's a lot of different tools that philanthropy can play. And for the most part, the world of impact investing, it's there, but I think there's a lot more room for folks to participate in and support. And it's a very different strategy than here's a grant, go away. When you've got a PRI and you've got an investment with either a CDFI or a foundation like FFL or whoever, that's a very different relationship, because you are truly partnering. You want to see Rashad thrive because he owes you $1 million. Right?
Yeah, so, that's true. That wraparound relationship is extremely important. And with those PRIs, I think the PRIs are vitally important. I would just challenge, the philanthropic world to think about these PRIs as a mix of debt and sort of how you would think of an equity fund. You'd have to really factor in some losses and be really comfortable with that, whether that's through a loan loss reserve that's provided, or just the way that the capital is structured. But if you want, it is going to be inherently a bit more risky lending to some of the folks that we want the underserved for folks, just by definition. So, having that in mind when we create these PRIs, I think is huge. And I've seen some good strides.
What a great role for philanthropy to take on this risk and support, these communities in different ways. Well, let's switch to everyone's favorite topic these days, COVID. And so I'm curious, as we talk about lending to communities of color or entrepreneurs of color, et cetera, are there any specific examples or characteristics or ideas that we should be aware of when lending to entrepreneurs of color, or maybe loans that are already out? What should we be thinking about, and what are you seeing?
It's going to be a tough period, I believe, for minorities of color, and just small businesses in general, but entrepreneurs of color, because COVID is causing, a shift in the market, whether it be moving from brick and mortar to online. Additionally, we have, I think, minority businesses, at least in my experience and some of the other reading I've seen, we're overrepresented in some of the more risky businesses. So you think about restaurants, think about consumer goods, those sort of things. We're overrepresented, and those are the ones that are getting hit the hardest. When we're talking about lending or maintaining those industries, it's really building in that cushion, because in addition to us being in these industries that are heavily service based, heavily touching, those kind of things, we don't have that capital reserve in place that other folks have. So, who knows how long this is going to take? That's a whole nother conversation. We're not doing ourselves any favors by the way that we've reopened the economy, but you're going to have to maintain on much less than you were maintaining before, where you may have been just holding on, pre-COVID. Now you're going to be surviving on 50% or less. So you need some cushion, some lines of credit that are reasonable, just to kind of keep things going. So that's where I think thinking.
And I imagine a lot of banks and a lot of bankers that I'm speaking with too are trying to be cool, trying to flex in terms of deferred payments and all of that, which is great. Of course, there's PPP funding. Whether you can get it or not is a whole nother question. So I think I was on with other folks, and they're encouraging all of their borrowers to reach out, talk to the bank, say, hey, here's what's going on. It's always better to communicate with your banker earlier than later, and ask for that, deferment, or be creative about how you can structure your loan repayment. Yeah.
I think that is key. So being able to reach out to you, and that goes into, I think the importance of Black-owned banks, the importance of community banks, because it's a lot easier, less intimidating to go and speak to some of these guys. But yeah, the deferments are great. Hopefully, I think it's going to require some government intervention. This may be a role for philanthropy as well, to get some of these debts forgiven, just to kind of keep the economy going or keep these businesses alive, because it's tough. There's not a business plan I've seen that factors in 6 months of zero income or a lot less income. So it's going to be a challenge. I think the folks that make it out of here will be stronger for it, but it's going to be a reckoning.
Yeah, I think so too. I think we should also be aware of how much money we're throwing at Amazon, and can we buy local? There's always that like buy local idea out there, but I think now it's even more important. I think what did I see today? Like Jeff Bezos clocked up another whatever $1 trillion to his net assets, and so, or net worth. So again, I think it's around let's connect with communities that we live in. A lot of folks are putting out different lists of companies that are owned by communities of color, or entrepreneurs of color, rather. I think it's important to, be aware of where your money is going, and let's be conscious with our money.
I agree with that 100%. And going back to the role of philanthropy, I think this is another spot. These philanthropic organizations are big, and they have a lot of money, and they have a lot of pull, and they sit at the same table, or maybe virtual table, as some of these guys. And this is where we get business involved, and see if Amazon can shift 2%. I mean, there's a thing going around with Michael Smith, I believe, that's pushing 2% to smaller businesses, and that'll make a huge difference. I try to buy local as much as I can.
It's tough though. It's tough right now.
It's tough. They're not. If their business model didn't do it, it's hard to shift to delivery and touchless sort of situation. And their relationship with their vendors aren't as strong as an Amazon or a Walmart. So
yeah. And I know this isn't your specialty, but I'm just curious, from your experience of lending to entrepreneurs of color, what do you see in terms of the needs for men versus women of color that are entrepreneurs? Is it? I assume it's. Well, I don't want to assume anything.
Yeah. it's women get the short end of the stick, and no matter what, bias, whether it's unconscious or conscious bias, I don't think they fare any, I mean, they maybe fare a little bit better, but it's, they still do worse on the margin. So, with it is difficult. I think they have the same challenges that other minority groups have. There's a built-in bias that we have to work around. I think that we need to figure out a way to reach out to these women-owned businesses early on and make those connections and make sure they have the proper accounting and legal representation and keeping and all of that kind of stuff, so that they have that their package is as good as it can be by the time it comes to a bank or wherever else. Because unfortunately, it just seems like they get looked at a little bit with a finer tooth comb. And the thing about lending, you know this as well or better than I do, as much of a science as it is to it, there's an art too. And so there is, it comes down to that little, tweak, I think we just need to be more conscious that we don't always give women that benefit of the doubt that we should, and just
shocking. And let's be honest, they're the stronger and smarter of the two sexes.
Oh, without a doubt, always more prepared, and more capable. So that's one thing that we just have to work out and be just. I think the first step is just acknowledging that they get a harder sweat at it, because we don't always do that, particularly if you're in another disadvantaged group. You start comparing who's more disadvantaged, and
right. That's a lot.
Stop doing.
No. That's a tough one. Okay, well, let's shift on to something a little bit more positive. We talked a little bit earlier about some of the bright spots. I'm just wondering, as I know you're in Houston now and previously in New Orleans, and connected to a number of different banking institutions and foundations or whatever, are you seeing any policy shifts? Are you seeing any new programs that you think have some potential, and maybe even just any other bright spots or a story of success would be great?
Right now there are, I think the PPP program by and large has been a success, for those that have been able to take advantage of it.
Right.
And I've seen people with more luck through minority institutions or smaller banks, credit unions, just being able to get through it. And I've been really encouraged, even though I have a fair amount of criticism towards the administration and the current and all these other sort of things, but I do think there are some flaws. But to be able to put together that program, and we still have a little ways with that forgiveness to make sure that works out how we expect. But I do give credit where it's due. I think that I've seen that work pretty well. Outside of a lot of people, a lot of banks are hesitant to lend just because one thing that is very hard for lenders to deal with is uncertainty. And so we just don't know, don't know what to do, or what things are going to look like. And you don't want to necessarily put someone in a worse position by lending them, especially with debt, with saddling them with additional debt, if we don't know. So it's a thin line to kind of navigate, and so we're trying to figure it out. But I do think the PPP has been helpful. Personal story, my mom is a small business owner in Ohio, and she was able to get the PPP later. The process was kind of difficult. I helped her walk through it, but that saved 20 plus jobs and allowed her to continue making service. And she was really on the brink of trying to figure out what to do. She's in a home healthcare business basically, and that's all touch, and that's all dependent on people going in. So and with a very vulnerable, people with mental MRDD and that kind of thing. So she's working with a delicate population.
During a delicate time.
So I I think that PPP has had some promise. I've talked to a few philanthropic groups that have some interesting ideas and that have shown a real commitment, particularly to borrowers that they have in their portfolio to keep them running. To go to your point earlier, that wrap around with the PRI, and they're really investing in their success. So I'm looking forward to see how we can make that go forward.
That's great. I'm just curious, going back to the personal story, it sounds like the PPP was really helpful for your mom's company. Great. And saved basically 20 jobs. I'm just curious, do you know who she employs? Are they men and women of color? Are they, whoever, or you don't know?
No. They're all, well, substantially, I'd say 80+% of them are men and women of color, primarily Black females that make up the workforce. So, and generally, home health care, it's a tough job, and so it's a tough job. And, my mom's been doing this business for 25 years. So, that was my first job. So it's, that she's employed a lot of people that might not have gotten a chance in some other places and helped build work history. So I am personally indebted to that program for helping keep the business alive.
And goes back to our point about, like, hello, women are the stronger of the two.
Without a doubt.
Right. So, well, any final remarks or ideas that you want to share with folks?
Yeah, I mean, we just got to keep up the fight. It's really interesting working in a more philanthropic nonprofit environment. Because, this country, like it or not, we're in a capitalist system that kind of runs in capitalist areas. And so there's the natural tension managing a loan fund, in that environment.
Yeah.
But, I think that we need to all be trying to figure out ways to build generational wealth, particularly with folks that have been left behind over the past century or two, or four centuries, And so it's a very difficult task that, you're not going to see immediate returns on. So it's something we need to be committed to. And I think we can close this gap. And I think philanthropy plays a huge role in closing the gap. And I think that, I just encourage everyone to keep up the fight. And, this too shall pass, as they say, with COVID-19. And, we can use this time to regroup and rethink and help better tool entrepreneurs of color in particular to be ready for this post-COVID economy. And so any ways and really start thinking out to get there.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rashad. This has been great. Give my best to your family. Let's go in for an elbow bump.
There you go.
All right, my friend. Be well. I'll talk to you later. Thanks so much, and I'll be in touch.
Thank you. Good talking to you.
All right. Cool.